If you look at the Studio Ghibli films made by Hayao Miyazaki, just about half of them are set in Europe or a Europe-inspired fantasy. In fact, when you think of the Studio Ghibli aesthetic, cozy and warm and homely, so much of it is associated with these alpine landscapes and quaint European towns. Even the very name Studio Ghibli comes from an Italian warplane nicknamed the Ghibli. So the questions one would naturally ask is, why? Why does Japan's most famous animation studio have so much of its work feature Europe, and how is Europe perceived by Miyazaki and his colleagues? The answer is simple and complex at the same time, and it has to do with both the exotic appeal of Europe to Japanese audiences, but also Miyazaki's personal lifelong interest in the continent. And also, as you'll see in this video, Europe provides a good setting for Miyazaki's harshest critiques. So, to understand Studio Ghibli's obsession with Europe, we need to go all the way back to learn about a young Hayao Miyazaki. According to Susan Napier, legendary anime scholar who wrote a biography on Miyazaki, Hayao loved reading as a boy, and in particular, he loved European children's books. She says, an avid reader of European, especially English literature, as well as science fiction and fantasy, he came to Japanese literature relatively late. From an early age, Miyazaki grew up reading about European settings and sharing in their cultural stories. But even as he got older, Miyazaki never lost this passion. And in fact, it was at university that he rediscovered his love for English literature. Apparently in Japan, study groups are an important part of college culture, back then and even today. And students love discussing everything from music to manga to science fiction. But with universities forbidding manga and sci-fi study groups in Miyazaki's time, he turned back towards children's literature, particularly the English literature of his childhood. So what we can take from this is that Miyazaki has always had these influences on his work. The images presented in European literature have always been a part of shaping him. But so too was his early career. When he joined Toei Animation in his 20s, Miyazaki worked on multiple European-inspired shows like Gulliver's Travels Beyond the Moon, a version of Puss in Boots, and Animal Treasure Island. But perhaps the work that Miyazaki received the most acclaim for in his pre-Ghibli days was the World Masterpiece Theater, and most notably amongst it, Heidi, Girl of the Alps. World Masterpiece Theater was a long-running Japanese series which adapted and serialized several popular children's works from around the world, most frequently from Europe. This included the Finnish Moomin, the Danish stories of Hans Christian Andersen, the British Peter Pan, and many others, but perhaps the most standout was the adaptation of the Swiss classic Heidi. The thing that set apart the production of Heidi and created a new tradition amongst Japanese animation was that Miyazaki actually went on a scouting trip to Switzerland in the 70s so that he could understand the setting better. Here is Yoichi Kotabe, the character artist that accompanied him, describing the process.
ところがいわゆる場面設計をやった宮崎駿はですね、ただ見て回ってるんですよね。景色なり、着ている服なり、建物なり、食器なり、ただ見てる。それを彼は一生懸命記憶してハンティング取り入れた。
Before this point, anime that depicted foreign settings would just go off vibes and things they've seen in other media. But after Miyazaki, Kotabe, and Isao Takahata went to Switzerland to get a really clear grasp of the location, this became a new tradition within anime production. It became more and more the norm for people to do this to make sure their imagery felt more authentic. For example, Heidi makes a rich friend named Clara who invites her to her home in Frankfurt. That house is based on this real-life location in Frankfurt. But it's not just the locations that the animators were observing in Switzerland. They also changed details about the main character. Apparently, Heidi's original design involved her having 2 pigtails, but they changed this after a Swiss librarian told them that a 5-year-old girl who lives in the mountains with just her grandfather wouldn't be able to tie one. So even before Studio Ghibli was ever a thing, Miyazaki was imbuing Europe into so much of his work. And not just vaguely European vibes, but with some real precision and detail. But ironically, that starts to shift after he sets up Studio Ghibli with Isao Takahata. So I don't just want to talk to you about why Miyazaki loves Europe, but also how he depicts it. A lot of Miyazaki's early Ghibli work is inspired by European literature. For example, Castle in the Sky. The image of a flying island in the sky, powered by technology and called Laputa, comes from Jonathan Swift's satirical Gulliver's Travels, which Miyazaki had read as a child. But it goes beyond inspiration, and there are some direct adaptations that come later. Howl's Moving Castle is based off of a British book, as is Arrietty, and while the original manga of Kiki's Delivery Service is written by a Japanese author, it's also set in Europe. But here's where things get interesting because, unlike with Heidi, Miyazaki and Ghibli stopped feeling the need to be fully faithful to the original setting of the work. Take Howl's Moving Castle for example. The original book is set in what we can assume is a British setting, though technically it's a fictional fantasy town called Market Chipping. But a significant element of the book takes place in real modern-day Wales, which is where Howl is originally shown to be from. Studio Ghibli not only opts to remove the section about Wales entirely, but also opts to set the film in a mishmash of Europe. Now, some aspects of it are very specific. For example, the town that Sophie lives in has some buildings that are directly inspired by the French town of Colmar. But as scholar Raina Dennison points out, the landscapes for Howl's Moving Castle were drawn as a collage of the Alsace-Lorraine region of Europe, though at one point, promotion for the film proclaimed far broader architectural influences. Sophie's hometown, for instance, is claimed to be an old architectural formula that can be seen in Wales and Yorkshire in England, in the Alsace-Lorraine area on the eastern border of France, and in the Romantic Road of southern Germany. As we can see, Ghibli begins to stray away from the idea of authentically representing one place and begins to just take specific elements from lots of different fun sources. Almost like a Pinterest board of European aesthetics that they can throw into one fictional setting. Miyazaki himself concedes that with a lot of these films, he's just making up a new version of Europe that he finds interesting. For Castle in the Sky, he says, "The setting is vaguely European, but we can't tell exactly what race or nationality its people are." And similarly for Kiki's Delivery Service, he says, "This is how the Japanese imagine an old European city. There are elements of Naples, Lisbon, Stockholm, Paris, and San Francisco all mixed in, so one side faces the Mediterranean while the other faces the Baltic Sea." Now, in my previous video, I spoke about Orientalism, which is a long literary tradition of Western literature depicting Asia as this mishmash exotic land. What Ghibli does could be called Occidentalism, the reverse. Asian people depicting Europe as a mishmash exotic land. But the difference, and why Orientalism is often problematic, is that it has a history of being condescending or derogatory. The people and cultures depicted in Orientalist stories are often presented as savage and stupid and backwards. In the case of Studio Ghibli's Occidentalism though, it comes from an equal place. Japan culturally does not view itself as inferior or inherently superior to Europe, broadly speaking. And secondly, it's also clear that this is a loving and glorifying portrayal, not a condescending one. In the way Ghibli depicts Europe, you can see a yearning for the lush mountains of the Alps, or the sweeping green fields of the lowlands, and the quaint architecture of the towns and settlements, even when these things no longer exist, if they ever even existed, in this kind of pristine beauty and harmony. In fact, one of the interesting things about Ghibli's depictions of Europe is that it is shown to be magical and wonderful, even when the reality is anything but. A good example would be Porco Rosso, which is set in a really difficult time. Our protagonist is a former World War I pilot and war hero who has magically been turned into a pig, and don't ask because you're not gonna get an answer. The film is explicitly set at a time when Mussolini is rising to power and fascism is taking over in Italy, with our character being pursued by the OVRA, the Italian version of the Gestapo. This of course gives us this iconic line when Porco's friend tells him that he can make his troubles go away by rejoining the military.
"Thanks for the offer, but I'd rather be a pig than a fascist."
But despite the bleak and politically charged setting of the film, the depictions of Europe do not match that tone at all. Italy and the Adriatic Sea, where Porco spends most of his time, are shown as this beautiful, almost idyllic paradise. The conflicts in the film are fairly trivial, just some personal grievances amongst immature men, and we're to understand that, for the most part, Porco spends his time relaxing in his picturesque, scenic hideout. Critic Chris Wood says of Porco Rosso, "The European setting is rendered as the object of a tourist gaze, a spectacular simulation, and a site of pleasurable consumption." Somehow, even when things should seem bleak or even terrifying, the Europe depicted in Studio Ghibli films is still a beautiful, wondrous place. The same is true of Miyazaki's other European war film, Howl's Moving Castle. Like I mentioned before, we have this source material which Miyazaki changes the location of, but also importantly, changes key plot details of. The war that dominates the climax in the movie version is not at all a feature of the novel, which is entirely focused on dealing with the Witch of the Waste. The decision to include this stems from Miyazaki's own personal abhorrence of war, something he knows all too well, having been born during World War II. At the time, the anti-war themes of Howl's Moving Castle were Miyazaki's way of criticizing the US invasion of Iraq, with Miyazaki famously boycotting his Oscar win for Spirited Away for the same reason. That same theme reappears in Porco Rosso, where the backdrop of war is inspired by real events. Miyazaki in an interview stated, "Really, it was based on my hobby, and I wanted to make something light. But then Yugoslavia collapsed, and all these conflicts broke out in Dubrovnik, Croatia, and the islands which were my setting. Suddenly in the real world, it became a place where battle was happening. So then Porco Rosso became a more complicated film." But you might ask why it was necessary for these films to be set in Europe, especially in the case of Howl's Moving Castle, which was not directly relevant to the US or the Middle East. Surely these films could have been set in, say, Japan for example, and still made their point. But this is where Miyazaki uses a tradition that has long been a staple of anime set in foreign lands. The distance allows for better critiques. As scholar Lucija Delić puts it, "It's more understandable why would Miyazaki use European city landscape, because this way he not only appeals to the wider audience, but also avoids triggering Japan's collective trauma of the nuclear wasteland. This is a great example of how creating a fictional space for exploring certain themes and dealing with tricky topics can be a powerful tool for allowing a more profound exploration of them." In a previous video, I've spoken about why so many anime in general are set in Europe, and one of the overlapping reasons here comes from the fact that putting your critique in a foreign land, and especially a fictional foreign land as most of these hodgepodge European cities are in Ghibli films, allows you to create distance from local Japanese criticism. In the case of anime, this started with shoujo anime in the 1970s, programs made for primarily young women. And these often explored themes of female empowerment and homosexual love, ideas which not everyone in Japan would have been happy to see explored. So by setting their shows in Europe, they could hide their progressive and potentially transgressive themes behind the banner of, well, this is Europe we're showing, not Japan. The same goes for Miyazaki's war themes. Rather than poke the sore spot of the destruction of Japan and evoke traumatic images for its people, he sets his films in fictional versions of Europe, which create enough distance as to allow him to get his message across without upsetting people when Sophie's hometown is being destroyed, for example. So those are the major takeaways that I had looking into this topic. Partly, Europe serves as a beautiful, exotic location that ties into not only Miyazaki's personal love and memories of the continent, but also the literature of his childhood. Europe is the perfect setting to mishmash his various passions and experiences. But on top of that, it also allows him the distance to explore themes that otherwise might be uncomfortable for Japanese audiences should the films have been set in Japan. And yet, even when the setting is a time of trouble in Europe, its depictions in Ghibli films are still lush and beautiful and serene. And as someone who calls Europe his home, perhaps we can all aim to make the world the kind of place it seems to be in a cozy Ghibli film. Thanks for watching this video. If you've made it all the way to this point, then I hope you will consider supporting me via Patreon. Video essays like this take a lot of time and research, and it is my full-time job. As you can see, there are no sponsorships in my videos because I want to avoid selling you scammy and weird products. But that does also mean I sacrifice a big payout when I do so. So personally, I'd much rather a system where my patrons support me directly and allow me to make authentic and meaningful content in return for their patronage. Alternatively, you can also use a one-time PayPal donation, the links to all of which are in the video description. I want to make a special shout out to my new highest tier patron, Bodevar Fredriksson, whose name I have no doubt butchered, as well as the other patrons who support me. You can come join our wonderful community on Discord, where we chat everything from TV to anime to music and games. And if you do enjoy games, you can come join me on my live stream on Twitch, where I'll be playing games like Final Fantasy XIV, Hades 2, and lots more. Again, all the links will be in the description. But that's it for now. I hope I'll see you again very soon, and I hope you have a wonderful day.